Jess Pettitt again, and today we are talking about Chapter 17, Department of Justice. Woo! What a chapter! My friend Dan from college, hi Dan, thank you very much for still being here, has stupidly agreed to read the chapter so that I am not just talking to myself about whatever the hell this is. I am not a lawyer. I like to joke that I was a ceramics major, and in reality, I was a ceramics minor, but that's not near as funny. Department of Justice. So before we get started on what the chapter actually says, I am being benevolent because my very opinionated friend Dan probably has something to say. So Dan, what is burning a hole in your pocket after reading this lovely use of the English language?
Well, this is an amazing it's an amazing read, I gotta tell you. In my opinion, the very definition of gaslighting by a very, very smart person. So Mr. Hamilton was part of the Department of Justice. He is a Trump appointee. He's worked under Sessions. He has a particular agenda that is clear as day. And it is very interesting because he uses it to the way he gets around to getting to where he wants the Department of Justice to be. Is by accusing the prior administrations of weaponizing and politicizing the Department of Justice, and then saying that his solution is the remedy. But in fact, what he is doing is creating a system, a very long-term structured system, by restructuring the Department of Justice to weaponize and politicize the Department of Justice in favor of his particular agenda. And his agenda is laced throughout this chapter that I'm sure we'll be talking about in his special interests. But the real reality, and I think the poison in this, is that this is a very, very well thought out plan to long-term restructure the Department of Justice in order to ensure compliance, not only within the Department of Justice and their employees themselves, but also through the federalist system through down to states, to ensure compliance with the agenda and to make the agenda fairly permanent. So that is, I think, the scariest thing, in my opinion, about this. And he does it fairly deftly as a response to this idea that he believes that the Biden administration had been using the Department of Justice either on what he called the Russian hoax election issues, or the, I guess, the laptop issue with Hunter Biden.
Hunter's laptop, not Hillary's laptop. That's gold. Now we're just at Hunter's laptop.
That's right. But if you really look what he does this through several different things. Restructuring from top down, how the Department of Justice is, and make sure that it is run through primarily political appointees as the CEO, CFO, if you will, of the Department of Justice, restructuring the FBI into the criminal division of the Department of Justice. And what this is doing is ensuring that the political appointees are the ones that are running the show, the ones that are underneath them. And he specifically states, right, that if they are not running the agenda of the president, that they need to be reprimanded, if not outright removed. And in fact, I believe he starts out saying everybody in the Department of Justice should be fired.
Yep.
As soon as they come into office, right? And then restructure everybody in there. So you have political appointees at the top that would be the heads of it. Everybody else has to follow suit. So it's a very, very rigorously structured and controlled idea. So there's no real room for individual ideas or your own view of what the Constitution is to say, which is specifically what lawyers are supposed to do. And I might as well say it, I'm a lawyer, and I know what my ethical boundaries are. And one of my ethical boundaries is I need to use my independent ideas of justice and understanding of the Constitution, regardless of what somebody else tells me to. So I was a prosecutor many, many years ago. And this is why I left the prosecutor's office, because the elected district attorney was informing me of what his view of justice should be, and it disagreed with my view of what justice was. And I believe that his view of justice was politically motivated because he was an elected official. So I left this type of organization, specifically because of what Mr. Hamilton is recommending. Now, can I just keep going, or do you want to stop me? Or do you want to redirect?
Can I pause you but not stop you?
Please.
Okay, so I'm going to pause a little bit because you've mentioned a lot of things and there's a lot of things that are in here. So some of them are patterns across the other chapters. So I want to point out the patterns as kind of just like given tropes of what we're talking about. Also, some people really might not know what the Department of Justice is. Like it gets talked about, but we might not really know about it. So I kind of want to back up a little bit. So the first thing I want to say is that the Department of Justice, based on my rudimentary Googling, which you have way more experience, not all the time are my friends talking to me actually an expert in the area. And you, of course, are not going to identify as an expert, but you're not a nobody. You're like tangentially familiar, if not an expert. But the nutshell of the Department of Justice is protecting public safety and defending the rule of law. Like that is what it's supposed to be doing. Generally speaking, it is an independent office from politics, which is functionally a definition of nonpartisan that we have used in the past. But the one of many baselines in the mandate for leadership is the quote, nonpartisan civil servants that are loyal to the president's agenda. So the gaslighting that you're talking about shows up in every chapter because basically they feel that Democrats are picking out winners and losers and they've been labeled the losers. So they want to flip everything so they can pick the winners and losers and make Democrats the losers. Why this is relevant as far as political appointees or firing everybody up. First off, political appointees are interim positions, won't require any kind of confirmation. And they're very worried about, quote, Democrats who have, quote, burrowed their way into the different departments and agencies that make up the federal government. They have no worry about very conservative people having burrowed their way in. And they might get fired throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But starting with loyalty to the loyalists who are loyal to the president's agenda, meaning a Trump conservative agenda, so that the next president has the same agenda, the next president has the same agenda. That's their rational thought. It's not about continuity as the pendulum swings. It's only this agenda for eternity. That's what they're shooting for.
Correct. Yes, correct. 100%. And as a matter of fact, I don't even think my read of Mr. Hamilton is that he is far, far even more to the right than any of our President Trump right now. So I think his view of what the Department of Justice could be is significantly different than what it's been intended to be. And you're right. So the Department of Justice is supposed to be an independent and should be based on the ideas of enforcing laws for the safety and protection of our country. It's run through the executive branch. So it is directly under, as part of the executive branch, it is directly under the auspices of the president, right? So, and this is where Gene Hamilton really goes into that idea that because he's part of the Department of Justice, that it is and should be basically a weapon to be utilized by the president to put forth his policies and agenda. And he says that very clearly at the end of the chapter, right?
Right.
The chapter.
We get to politicize and weaponize the Department of Justice, not you.
Right. That's correct. That is correct. And it is amazingly, he starts from the idea that he is trying to remedy that idea with the Department of Justice, only to very, very completely 20 pages in, make sure that the department is, and like you said, in a very permanent sense, weaponized and politicized in his agenda, right? So, and then we have interesting things that he really wants to look at to ensure that this is permanent, right? What is he then do? So not just fire everybody, put in the appointments, restructure it, and then make sure that if anybody doesn't follow the policies, that they would be reprimanded, if not terminated, or their law license might be in jeopardy. But then he says we need to ensure that we're having fair elections, right? We're now going to involve not the Civil Rights Division, but specifically change that to the Criminal Division, and that we're going to overrule what is already the standard. Which the standard is that state actors enforce election laws at the local levels, and they do that for a very particular reason. One, logistics. Two, it is because we don't want the power, the people that are in power on the federal level and the most centralized level and highest level of authority, then making sure how the rules are enforced at the election levels, right? So that is not just a separation of powers issue, but it's a federalist issue, right? It's an idea that every state should have its ability to enforce its own elections. And that's a sovereignty issue at the state level. We get rid of that, and we have the federal agents coming in and enforcing the federal Department of Justice elections. Now it's much more easy because it's a centralized system to be able to affect the outcome of the elections. And that stabilizes this now newly formed Department of Justice. Now, same type of thing. What else does he recommend? Said, well, immigration is such a concern, right? He's the biggest anti-immigration person in the world. But what he definitely does do, though, is that he says, well, since immigration is such a concern, fentanyl's coming in. Well, my God, the only way we can do that to ensure and to protect everybody, to make sure that we're as safe as humanly possible, is to use active military. For the first time since 1878, I think, which is the Posse Comitatus Act, which states that we're not going to use active military on domestic soil, right? That's since the Civil War reparations. What's the act? But anyway, we haven't done that since 1878, I believe. So
technically speaking, we haven't done it. We have released the National Guard. We have bombed Oklahoma. We have done some things that we try really hard not to think about because we're like a racist, awful, horrible place. But we have not had tanks rolling down our streets with the goal of actual combat, unless we start talking about protective actions. Specifically, I'm thinking about like BLM marches during COVID, things like that, and that local jurisdictions, local municipalities, some of them have their own tanks, but they weren't federally mandated to go out.
So the other thing I thought interesting with the active military issues is that he then goes in and says, well, and if we have these states that are, sanctuary cities, and again, this is under the auspices of his immigration policies, which are atrocious in my opinion. But that's the point that I want to get at. The point I want to get at is the restructuring of power in this country. And he says, well, if these sanctuary cities aren't following and enforcing federal law, which, by the way, he's absolutely dead wrong on the law in here in a second, I'll get to, that they need to be reprimanded now, and that we should be able to use the Department of Justice to come in and criminally prosecute people that are failing at the local levels or the state levels to enforce federal law. Now, that's contrary to the current status of the law. And there is a case in Arizona with Sheriff Arpaio, I believe his name is, started trying to enforce federal immigration law using state agents.
And fun fact, he was pardoned by Trump in his first administration, just for the record.
In the blink of an eye, right? But what did the court say? The court said, listen, that's not it's not your job to enforce federal action. In fact, that's why we have ICE and we have the federal systems to enforce that. And you can only enforce what you're entitled to enforce in your jurisdiction, which is the state laws. And so Hamilton obviously just disagrees with that bluntly. And the reason is because he wants he doesn't want a federal system with state sovereignty. He wants this to be run through and only the federal system that would be controlled by and enforced by his version of the Department of Justice. So
Yeah.
what that ends up being, regardless of what he does talk about this country being a constitutional republic, but I think that then he blurs the lines between that and what would be a federally run fascist system.
Mm-hmm.
And not in a very literal sense that fascism is a structured government that runs with a centralized dominant federal power, and then instead of having states with dual sovereignty, they have governor appointees of regions, but they are all still controlled by a unified federal system, which is basically exactly what he's setting up. And that is the scariest thing that I have ever thought about reading. So now we can talk about all the other stuff too, which is all interesting because he can't stop, like I said, putting his hand in his little special interest pots, right? Whether it's immigration, LGBTQI issues,
Right. Pregnancy centers, gutting the FBI, H-1B visas, like most of the chapters, I feel like there's like gossipy post-it notes on their desk, and so they just make sure to like throw them in. There's not really a high writing standard, so it doesn't actually matter if something goes off topic. There are a couple of things though, because I want to make sure we are demystifying what is actually in the chapter, right? So Dan, I think you've done an excellent job of really highlighting like the structural terror that is in the chapter. Some of the other things that are mentioned though, we've even seen, we're recording this in the first week of Trump's second administration. And so some of it we're already kind of seeing. So I want to spend a little bit of time on some of those pieces, assuming we have time. And then we're going to pivot to like, what do we do as like a regular person at our dining room table? So first, just to review the shopping list. The key points, according to Stop the Coup 2025. Thank you again for doing these summaries. So I think there's like 9 of them. So 1, we already talked about, replace career civil servants with a vast expansion of political appointees, which don't have to be confirmed. Overturn the current politicalization and weaponization of the Department of Justice so that we can do our own politicalization, weaponization. Dan already talked about that. Enact a complete review of the FBI, which really starts with reviewing all cases that the FBI is currently working on and seeing a way forward only for the cases that align with law enforcement, national security, and the president's agenda. So then just dropping any other FBI investigation that isn't in alignment with that. Really focusing on free speech, not misinformation or disinformation cases, putting that all under free speech. There's nothing to investigate. And streamlining while shrinking the role of the FBI and its investigations generally. Excellent. Okay. Then more little points. Deny Russian election interference and the constant flow of misinformation. Secure the border, rigorously enforce immigration laws, help Department of Homeland Security pursue criminal aliens. Ban all DEI initiatives as racist. This one usually makes people scratch their head, but the logic, if I can call it that, is that by identifying people who have inequitable opportunities, you are then creating more inequitable opportunities for the people who are in privileged or dominant identity spaces. So by identifying people of color, white people are suffering, which then makes it racist. Just to follow their logic. Okay, 3 more. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that is very clear that Gene Hamilton in this case doesn't acknowledge that there are people that have characteristics that are immutable and unchangeable and that have been denied access to places because of those characteristics. That, frankly, DEI tries to recognize. And he says the fact that we even try to acknowledge that, therefore, is also therefore racist,
Right.
And or sexist or whatever.
Right.
And
But most of the arguments do rest on the denial of opportunity by being a white man or heterosexual or something like that. So they are doing it, but not extending it to other people. Okay, 3 more bullet points, and then I think we're going to go back to just like violent crimes in general. So prosecute voter fraud, transfer this responsibility to the criminal division. Halt investigations of group engaging in lawful and often constitutionally protected activity. This is that free speech or storming the Capitol because they were protecting the country, that kind of logic. And then lastly, execute all 44 remaining prisoners on federal death row and pursue the death penalty for violence and sexual abuse of children. Now, on the last one, and then we'll go to violent crime. My understanding is that Biden, on his way out, has commuted every federal prisoner on death row so that they cannot now get the death penalty because their sentence has been commuted into, they're still serving life sentences, but they're not on death row anymore. There are no remaining people on federal death row except the 3 people who were found guilty of hate crimes by shooting up a synagogue, churches, etc. Those 3 people remain on death row in federal prisons. I believe that is true. Correct me.
That's my understanding. The big point here is, and it's been terribly misreported, they weren't released, right? Their sentence was commuted to life in prison without the opportunity of parole, which means that they will be in a box for the rest of their lives. So
in contrast, the January 6th folks who pled guilty to violent crimes have actually been released.
correct. And even the ones that openly assaulted a police officer
Right.
during that action, violent crime, which Trump said that he wasn't going to pardon those
Right.
people.
Right. Because I think that there might possibly have been a thought of like sorting through the pile, and then that didn't seem fast enough. So they just.
So if you're a hardened up supporter of Trump, or if you're, and frankly, I'm just going to say it, distantly related to Biden, you're going to get pardoned when nobody else does. So
yeah. Yeah, and as the resident Pinko Commie liberal on the call, I love you, Dan. I want to state that I am concerned about the future of the power of the pardon because there are now preemptive pardons where no crime has been filed or accused.
never
There
happened.
are preemptive pardons of people who haven't even been involved in something, but it's to protect them from further future attack. I don't really think that's how we're supposed to use pardons.
Nope.
And if I was in that position, I probably would have protected my friends and family too. But I don't think you're supposed to.
It's a long ways away from saying, I'm going to protect Billy Carter, my brother, because he's a bit of an idiot and I love him to death, but he's not really that dangerous. And I'm just going to give him a pardon because I'm president. And we all said, okay. But now it's gotten to the point where they're getting open-ended pardons for decades worth of conduct. I don't think that's where it's supposed to go. And it's only going to get, as far as that goes, it's only going to get worse. Now, as far as, I don't know how much we want to talk about the death penalty. I think it's a very small part of this chapter, but
let me throw out some words and then you can just be smart. How's that? So under violent crime, it does talk about the death penalty, but I think Biden did something that kind of undoes what the Heritage Foundation wanted to do. So we could focus on their focus for violent crime is sexual abuse of children, is what they say, cartels, the border, ransomware, and then sextortion and child pornography. Other than that, there's no such thing as violent crime. Those are the only things that should be focused on. I would like to point out that that does not include like murder, sexual assault.
nope.
Nope, not even mentioned. Nope. Okay, please go be smart. I'll just be over here drinking water.
I mean, to be fair to the chapter, he is talking about federal laws, and federal laws generally don't involve general policing. That's usually reserved for the states. So, for instance, California, Colorado, Arizona, New York, whatever, all have their own criminal codes, and they enforce it on the state level. So your typical murder, I hate to say it, your typical sexual assault, your typical theft is going to be prosecuted at the state level. So in order for federal jurisdiction to attach, it has to have usually an interstate aspect to it, some sort of federal special interest that in order for it to fall under United States code. So that's where you see drug interdiction, kidnapping between state lines, these things that the states themselves can't handle in their general policing power. So
that kicks up to federal? Oh, okay.
It does. Now, he is talking about certain things, and it is interesting to me when I believe the government wants to expand its power, it's going to reach out to the easiest and most relatable idea to the common person. Who here is in favor of children being sexually assaulted?
I'm going to go with I'm not in favor of anyone of any age being sexually assaulted.
Especially children, right? Because as soon as we bring up sexual assault and children, then whatever we need to do to protect them, we should do, right? So it is
fair, clean
to give the government as much power as they need to be able to protect those children. And this is a government, a political trope that whenever they want to expand their power, they're going to use the most deserving of protection of all of our society. Children, victims of sexual assault, etc. So I think every time I see that, I say, okay, what is he really asking for? And what he's asking for is the restructuring of and the centralization of power, and especially relocating it and time again, always through the criminal division of the Department of Justice. Right. So what that is taking power away from the states, taking power away from the local communities, and restructuring it into centralized power. So that is my thoughts when I read that.
I was just going to add that I think it is also important to mention that because we're not looking at other instances, if we are using the protection of the children who are in danger of sexual abuse, we don't mean, and by we, I mean Heritage Foundation, does not mean children who are refugees or immigrating who have experienced or in danger of sexual abuse or trafficking. We don't, that's not counts.
Yes, you did a great thing in bringing it up. Thank you. So Gene Hamilton, I think it was under Sessions, not only tried to destroy DACA, right, which is allowing children that were born here but of undocumented families to being deported to a country they've never been to. But he also was very heavily in favor of family separation. Now, family separation and immigration issues is that when you're deporting, you're breaking up a family, and half the family is going to stay in America and half is going to go back to another country, typically somewhere Mexico or South. Not only did he find that a lamentable side effect of enforcing immigration issues, which I think maybe conservative people could say, well, yes, that's an unfortunate, terrible side effect, but immigration rules are immigration rules and you broke them, right? So that's one thing. No, Hamilton's actually in favor of it, right. Openly in favor of it. So,
and I always think this is really important to mention too, is that towards the end of Trump's administration, the family separation that got the news, these were families who were coming across the border here together, who were separated before they did the paperwork to enter the United States officially. So when we talk about family child separation, there's multiple iterations of this that are all falling under that kind of yeah, well, you do the rules, this is a side effect. So already living here, splitting up the families, the current border czar is oh, okay, well then just deport the entire family, which would include U.S. citizens. But if we don't have naturalized citizenship, then maybe that's a loophole.
You can't do that. The only reason that they're even saying that you can do that is because they're brown people. I'm sorry. I'm just going to say it.
No,
That is absolutely in violation of our Constitution. These are natural born citizens. You can't deport them. Can't do it.
right. Also, just to prove this point, Barron Trump is a naturalized citizen because he was born in March and Melania got citizenship in April. Let's do
Well,
the math
you didn't know that.
afterwards. But Barron is not brown.
Right. So while we're on immigration anyway, I also wanted to point this out too, because again, like we were talking about using the those of our society that need the most protection in order to get the most power to the government. That happens in immigration and his fentanyl arguments equally, right? When he's talking about enforcing immigration laws strictly, blindingly strictly, right? And that means going after people within the Department of Justice that aren't going and trying to get the maximum penalties for even simple possession of drugs if they're illegal consequence, if there's immigration consequences. And he specifically targets people with immigration issues, right? Not just saying we're going to go back to the war on drugs in 1984 version of it, or a 1992 version of it with mandatory prison laws and everything else that never worked. No, we're going to specifically target people with immigration consequences and go after them harsher than everybody else. But he defends it again with, well, because we need strong borders to keep the fentanyl out. We need to keep these the rapists and murderers out of our country, the MS-13 gangs specifically noted, the cartels specifically noted. And those are a lot of those people are very dangerous people, right? And what does he say? Not only do the Department of Justice we're going to come down, we're going to come down on local officials, specifically even district attorneys at the state level, and go after them potentially criminally to enforce my version of immigration laws at the local level, which is a terrifying grab of power.
And it's a similar parallel, or at least it sounds like a similar parallel to going after doctors or medical care providers criminally for offering any kind of women's health care, pregnancy care, abortion care that crosses some arbitrary line of a local municipality or state definition of what is legal or not legal healthcare.
And that is exactly right. But you're also talking about elected officials at the state level that they're going to go after criminally on a federal level. So it's not only that is a destruction of our system of federalism, right? So we have state-sided federalism, generally speaking, in this country, and we have states with their own constitutions, and we have a notion of dual sovereignty, which is being absolutely erased by this idea, right? So that's federalizing, centralizing all the power in order to keep it the exact same stability and a permanent, basically, redefinition of culture in the way that he sees fit.
So I have a question for you, because I wrote this down and I was like pretty stunned that it was in the chapter because of that exact point that you're making. So in one breath, it says like litigations must align with the president's policy and agenda because the president's policy and agenda is the rule of law. Question marks not allowed, period. The president's agenda, meaning only a conservative president's agenda for the record, is policy, agenda, rule of law, period, done, no questions. But then it actually says in the chapter, I feel like his kid edited this essay and was like, but what about this? And then he didn't notice. And so it stayed in, even though obviously that is not something Hamilton would agree with. But it says, and encourages pushback among the branches as a strength of Federalist power. Now, I am a big fan of checks and balances, but we have to get rid of the checks and balances if we're going to do this one agenda loyalty kick, because the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch are supposed to be checking and balancing each other. And the states are supposed to be able to check and balance each other at the same time, like rubbing your belly and patting your head at the same time. For it to articulate that it values the pushback, to me, seems like somebody was like, yeah, that's how democracy works. but they forgot to edit that sentence out. Am I being crazy pants?
I'm perhaps I'm just as cynical as I am. I think it is what he's trying to get to, and he just doesn't want to openly say it, is a refutation of the idea of judicial review, which comes from Madison versus Marbury. Marbury versus Madison, excuse me, I got that backwards. Whoops, it's only the most important case ever. So
Yeah, you're going to need to break this down for ceramics majors. Okay.
the
What?
concept of judicial review came out through a case that was very important, and John Marshall, a long time ago, just basically stated in his decision that the Supreme Court has the ability to review acts of either legislative acts or acts of in the case was the executive branch. And the issue is over fairly innocuous stuff, is that Madison didn't want to sign these papers that were appointments of political positions from the prior administration. And he said, well, no, Supreme Court gets to review that as to whether or not that's a constitutional act of the president, right? And that little thing generated an entire idea that is not specifically stated in the Constitution in any of the articles, which is that the Supreme Court has basically the final say of what the Constitution means. Now, what he's trying to say in this thing is that no, every branch has basically an equal say in what the
Okay.
Constitution means, right? So what I think he's trying to do is refute the ability of the Supreme Court and federal courts to exert authority when the other branches of government aren't following the Constitution. So there's many people that believe, for instance, that the Supreme Court should not have the authority to say that what say Donald Trump or President Biden is doing is unconstitutional. That tends to be on the very far right, because obviously, what did the Supreme Court do? Oh, I don't know. Coming in with equal rights. Let's get rid of separate but equal notions. All of these things. Almost every important civil right that we've ever had has come from the courts and not from, generally speaking, the president. There's exceptions, of course.
Right. Or legislative initiatives where Congress's theory is supposed to be creating the legislation that is then enforced as informed by executive.
Major changes that have protected minority people from the tyranny of the majority, from racism, from notions like that have come from the courts. So I think that's what he's getting at. I could be reading it, but that's my take from that.
Well, for the average person procrastinating putting the dishes away who is listening or watching this, then I would say somewhere in between someone who actually went to law school and someone who doesn't even watch Law and Order is the truth.
Well, I
probably more on your side of that spectrum. I'm just gonna guess.
You brought up something very interesting though that I didn't really put my finger on until you talked about it. And that's the idea of this notion that the policies and agenda of the presiding president are more important than the fundamental concepts of what the Department of Justice is supposed to do. Going back to where it's supposed to be an independent.
Right. The actual litigation is just a consistent reinforcement of the president's agenda, not the reinforcement of the Constitution or truth.
Right. So the Department of Justice has two primary functions: protecting public safety and defending the rule of law. So that should be changed then to protecting public safety and defending the agenda of the President of the United States.
I think that actually would make every author of the Mandate for Leadership very happy. I think that there's now a 33rd chapter. Thanks, Dan.
Right. That goes all the way back to pre-Magna Carta notions, right? Where the rule of man is more important than the rule of law. And the rule of man used to be what we would call a monarch of the king, right? And that's why the Magna Carta even existed way prior to us. And our constitutional republic has firm blocks in place to prevent that.
Right.
Hamilton
But
needs to
for
go
your
back.
average bear, right? Like people who have lived inside of a democracy and not experienced any other form of government or rule of law really maybe don't understand that like when we talk about an oligarchy or a king, this is what we're talking about, is that it has to stay this way forever, and the
Right.
current iteration of this ideological forever is the number one priority, and it cannot be challenged, it cannot be questioned, it cannot be denied, it cannot be referred to in any kind of nuanced way that may or may not work, and it doesn't get to progress or move forward. It just is. It just is. And I feel like there's so much stuff that, I mean, maybe this is because you and I talked about this the other day, but because I lived in a country during the fall of communism, I actually had an immersive experience protected by the United States. If anything happened to me, a white Ford Explorer would have come and swooped me up and taken me away, right? Like I wasn't absolved of my American protections, but I also was in a country that was dealing with so much political and economic strife that I had the safety of pulling in Uncle Sam, but I knew better, and I was able to like see what the US and quote unquote democracy does for good and possibly for questionables. But most U.S. residents have not had an experience of what that means. So when, like you say, like we're talking all the way back to Magna Carta, this is like what a king does. What that really means here is that you don't get to question it.
That's
It's
right.
not about your voice. They don't care. You have no intellectual, emotional, spiritual, or physical value other than being a serf to a king, so that the king feels served by likely his population. And I don't know that there's enough of a real understanding of that. So when like little flippant things like election fraud should isn't even criminal, right? Like I mean maybe it could be looked into, but our kind is not criminal. We might not even have elections anymore because why would we need them? We don't need the populist voice. When we look at H-1B visas, which randomly of all the different kinds of visas have already been mentioned since Trump won, but that it discriminates against US citizens' work, but also is the type of work that the US doesn't feel it's great at. So then brain draining other countries could actually be something that's like trade based combat of pulling away these skills into the US. So it's not about immigration, it's about um, business profitability and the ability to create innovation and being America first or America dependent on its technology without having to rely on other countries, right? Like this is an insulated situation. The two more, and then I'm going to shut up. When we're talking about judicial nominations or even inside the legislative affairs or Congress the committee, there's a call to review the previous 4 years, only during Biden's term, of sanctions and findings to see that they are being prejudicial towards a more progressive or liberal agenda and not the Trump agenda or the Heritage Foundation conservative agenda. And if that's the case, to overturn them. And we're already seeing this happening because it's not seen as valuable, because the rule of law is not valuable unless it is loyal to the president's agenda. Yikes.
Yeah. And the only reason he didn't go farther than that because it takes an act of Congress to impeach a federal judge. If he could get around that, he would happily do so. So yeah. So I mean, it's very clear. And
How do you spell? Yeah. The only other little random splatter of paint in the chapter is there is a call out from the EPA. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency chapter, basically says, because they're going to dismantle the whole EPA, that the general counsel within the EPA should be moved to the Department of Justice and the Department of Justice would then only litigate cases that are in alignment with the president's agenda. So then there would be a way to actually punish states or private companies that are trying to abide by standards that, quote, peer pressure other businesses into doing things that are like good for people or the planet.
Well, I mean, he's consistent. I'll give him that, right? So any chance he can find a way to uh, centralize even more power and take away any type of independent or autonomous thought process, he's gonna want to incorporate it into this grand new Department of Justice, and especially the criminal division, which he's apparently going to run. So,
Sounds amazing. Oh my God. All right. So now here's the hard part, Dan. Regular, normal folks, whatever regular and whatever normal means. I think this is one of the chapters that's pretty hard to not just feel completely defeated, because the main power that I think the citizenry or the residents of the United States have is related to their voice, the accountability or pushback. And if that is not, if there's no space for voice and pushback, I don't know that that is going to make it be heard. And I don't know that getting louder is going to work. So, regular Joe people, what should we be doing so that we can remain conscious of what is actually happening around us? I'm a little more stuck on this chapter than I am other chapters. So I'm curious if you have ideas.
I do. I think the power that people have is very underestimated at the national level. So I mean, when we think about this, when we have the federal power, it's all the way over there in D.C., right? And it's very seems like it's a handful of people within the Beltway, and it's been going on that way forever. And what can I do about it? Because that's already been predetermined almost, right? So, but the reality is that the things are most easily affected at the local level, and we have seen the power of our voices change things. And I'm looking in particular at the George Floyd and Elijah McClain protest movements that swept through the nation have generated a lot of, we still need a lot more to do it, but have generated a lot of movements and police agents starting to look at themselves and at least starting to look at their policies, starting to get ideas of what they can do to de-escalate situations and actually have people coming in for training. Now, I'm involved in that area of litigation, as you well know. We have a lot more work to do, but that was a significant movement. And we're also seeing that has resulted in changes in how the cities have been implementing things, because frankly, they began losing lawsuits that they used to win. And the jury, right? And that costs their pocketbook. Now, what I'm trying to get though too is that at the local level, if you are aware and you are involved, you are going to affect change. That local level then affect change at the state level. Now, what's scary about this is the grab of power is to try to keep it all in the federal system, which is the farthest away from you and I and anybody sitting down at the dinner table to keep the power away from the people as much as humanly possible. That's what Mr. Hamilton wants. Mr. Hamilton does not want you involved.
Do you think, and I really am legitimately asking this because I know that I can be a touch naive and optimistic sometimes. Don't tell my friend Dan I said that. But if I'm being a touch naive or optimistic, is just paying attention and like connecting dots and asking questions, is that enough involvement if compared to Hamilton's wishes of zero access to be involved? Is that enough?
I mean, no, that's a good point. I mean, obviously, when I'm saying get involved, that means at least at the local level, that means getting out and doing something and making sure that you're opinions are being heard and listened to. And I always start at the local level because that's where we can affect it the most, right? I mean, you can go march on Washington, and that has worked in the past, but the most in the most access you have to changing government and getting people in like-minded is at the local level, at the state level, getting the state legislatures to be aware of what your concerns are, what the concerns are of everybody else, and that will get up. It will build up to the federal system. It will, but it does involve keeping us. What if we don't act on our civil rights, if we don't protect our civil rights vigorously against the government will take that. They will take the power. And the
As
government
evidenced.
power.
Yep.
Again, and once the government takes the power, and it always starts with trust me, I'm going to do this to protect you. Trust me, let me have this power, and you give it away and you never get it back. So
It reminds me of
I'm
something.
also very much a libertarian, so
I know, but I love you anyway. That it reminds me of something, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I think it needs to be invoked, and I want to be conscious of our time. But when COVID was going, hardcore COVID was going, like pre-vaccine COVID. I live in California. Everything was closed. Everything was in shelter-in-place mode, and there was a protest in the streets of my teeny tiny little baby town. Thank you. So
love.
we were trying to figure out what should we do, what can we do, and there were a lot of options, right? And like I think there was my partner was very much like into the streets, like let's go. And I have well, I guess I had a lung issue that seemed to have cured itself during COVID, so now it's past tense. I was terrified of getting sick of whatever COVID was, right? Now, I could have marched in the streets, but I also don't really like walking aimlessly for hours and hours and hours in the middle of a global pandemic when I'm like anxious already and nervous about getting sick. I didn't want to get anybody else sick. I didn't know what to do. So, what we ended up doing was I had a Fiat at the time. So, we got in the car and we drove, and I parked my Fiat in the middle of the intersections so that no traffic could move and people could walk whatever direction they were going to. So I was in my little bubble so that I felt safe, but I was also able to do something that I could at least write a story myself that was helpful to the other folks because I could stop traffic or block traffic with my car so that the people could cross. And it seemed, especially if I think in light of like other forms of activism that I have done in my 50 some odd years of being alive, it seemed so trivial and tiny. And I felt weak for being scared because it wasn't big and sexy and it wasn't writing a check or doing something that at least I could like fall into my class privilege to be supporting something larger. It wasn't any of those things. But it was something inside of my own capacity that was able to be helpful. And so I think staying abreast of things, asking questions, paying attention, I do think that that's a really important piece because to your point, there is a power grab going on and we are watching it happen instead of actively fighting back for it. But the actively fighting back for it could be something as small as parking your car in the middle of an intersection. Go ahead.
And what was the response? I'm not sure about in your town, but I can tell you what the response was in Denver. That if you think that that doesn't have meaning and that the government wasn't scared of what was happening, what was their response? The response in Denver was to make a fake curfew, bring out everybody in military gear with pepper balls, 40 millimeter gas canisters, and attack the crowd. I have I have hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage of what Denver did, and we are involved in many, many lawsuits. And you think that the government wasn't scared of that protest movement, they wouldn't have reacted that way. They just would have let it happen. So that I think goes to your point that little actions do make differences, and the government knew it, and the government was scared of it. So,
Well, that is a really powerful place to wrap this, because the idea of these is to be thought-provoking, but also really demystifying what is the Department of Justice, what does the Heritage Foundation say about it, and if we can land on every little thing matters, and if the power we have to instill fear is much bigger than a few people trying to scare us. And I think that that is an important note to end on.
I think that's wonderful. Sorry you picked me to try to explain all of this. I think
No,
anyone else could have done a better job, but I enjoyed it.
even if it's slim pickings, it's wonderful. If there is anything that I think is a larger active resistance here, the authors of the Mandate for Leadership clearly did not talk to each other. They are not in community with each other. They stapled a bunch of poorly written essays together and called it the Mandate for Leadership, and they've been doing that since 1979. The least thing I could do is reconnect with my friends and my family, have intellectual conversations about what it is that we could do, so that at least us, 2x2, 3x2, we can know what we need to be doing and making this stuff available. This is an act of resistance, and I am honored to be able to do it with you. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you so much, Jess.